sandbags were her idea. I want to say that plainly, right at the start, before I say anything else. Because there are men in this valley. Men who sat at my table and ate my beef and drank my whiskey for 20 years. Who will tell you different. They'll say I figured it out. They'll say Harlan Cross saw the breach coming and moved on it. They'll build it into the story of me the way men do, folding a woman's sharp mind into a man's legend without ever noticing what they've done. The sandbags were Nora Voss's idea. She was standing ankle-deep in the South Channel, in the dark and the cold, pointing at the cut bank with a stick she'd pulled off a willow, and she was right. That's the whole of it. Everything else, the marriage, the land, the life we built after, that all came from her being right about the water, and me being old enough and tired enough, and maybe just honest enough to know it. I need to go back a ways. I need to go back to the spring before that night, because nothing makes sense without the ground under it, and the ground under it was a drought that broke wrong. We'd had 3 dry years in the Ancora Valley, 3 years where the grass went brittle by June, and the creek ran brown and thin by August. And you counted your herd by what you'd sold in the fall, not what you had left. My hands quit, one by one, not because I didn't pay. I paid. But because there's a particular kind of misery in working land that's giving up on itself, and men feel it. They drift toward water, the way cattle do. They just do it with their boots on, and their wages in their pocket. By the 3rd dry winter I was running the Cross Ranch, with 2 hired men and my foreman, Del Pruitt, who was 63 years old, moved like he was carrying a piano on his back, and wouldn't have left if I'd fired him. Which I didn't, because Del Pruitt was the best cattleman I ever knew, and I needed him more than I needed my pride. Then the spring came, and it came wrong. It didn't rain the way drought breaks. Slow and soaking, building the creek back up gradual. It came in a week of hard storms off the mountains. One after another, the kind where you can't see the ridgeline and the thunder sits right on top of you and doesn't move. The creek went from a trickle to a roar in 4 days. By the 5th day, the South Channel was running bank to bank, and by the 6th, I had 3 low sections of fence down and 30 head of cattle standing in 6 inches of moving water looking at me like I was supposed to explain myself. That was bad. What was worse was the cut bank situation on the south end of the property, where the channel bent hard east and had been undercutting that bank since before I bought the land. I'd meant to address it for years. I'd looked at it, ridden around it, told Del I needed to address it, and then addressed other things instead. 3 dry years had pushed it further down the list. Now I was looking at a swollen creek with the bank already crumbling, and if that bank went, the channel would jump. And if the channel jumped, it would take the south pasture, and the south pasture was where I'd planted the new grass, $1,000 worth of seeded bottomland. That was supposed to pull me back from the edge of what 3 bad years had done to me. I'd have lost it. I think I need to say that plainly too, the same way I said the sandbags were her idea. If the bank had gone that spring, I'd have lost the Cross Ranch within the year, the bank and the pasture, and then the creditors, in that order. I was that close. I'm getting ahead of myself. The homestead filings had started coming into the valley 2 years into the drought. Is not the timing you'd expect, but is, when you think about it, exactly the timing. Land that's in trouble looks cheap from the outside. People who couldn't afford valley ground in a good year saw an opening. I didn't like it. I'll be honest about that too, since I'm being honest about everything else. I was the largest landowner in the Ancora Valley. 22,000 acres, 3 generations of cross-family blood in the soil, and watching quarter-section homesteads get staked along my south and east borders felt like being crowded at a table where I was already sitting. It wasn't fair, exactly what I felt, but it was what I felt. Most of the homesteaders were families. Men with children, coming out of Nebraska and Iowa and Missouri, and they were doing what people do, looking for a way to live, and I knew that, and I kept my distance and my opinion mostly to myself. Del, who had a kinder nature than I did, said they'd either make it or they wouldn't, and either way they weren't my problem. Then Nora Voss filed on the quarter section at the bend of the South Channel. Her husband had filed it the year before. Otto Voss, a German-born man, with a black beard and a careful way of moving, like he was always measuring the space around him. He'd come to the valley with a wagon and a mule team, and a young wife, and a particular intensity that I recognized as the intensity of a man who has decided he is going to make something work. He'd built a small house, boards and tar paper, not much, solid, and broken 2 acres of ground, and started running a few cattle on the creek bottom. Then in February, 7 months before the hard rain, Otto Voss had gone through the ice on the North Pond, checking on a heifer. They found him the next morning. The wife stayed. That surprised people. It surprised me. There was nothing holding her there. No children, no family in the valley, quarter section of marginal ground, with a creek running through it that was worthless in a drought. She was 28 years old. She could have gone back east, gone anywhere. People, my kind of people, valley people who'd been there a long time, assumed she'd go. They gave her until the snow melted. She didn't go. I saw her twice at the Dunmore trading post before the spring rains hit. Once in March, buying seed and wire, and I watched her load the wagon herself, because there was nobody with her, and she loaded it the way a person loads a wagon when they've done it 100 times, and their mind is already on the next thing. Efficient. Not asking for help, not looking around to see if anyone was watching. Second time was in April. She was arguing with Clyde Dunmore about the price of flour. And she was winning. Clyde Dunmore was a man who had been running that trading post for 30 years, and did not lose arguments about price. I stood near the rope coils and listened to her for about 2 minutes, and I thought, that woman is going to be a problem for somebody. I didn't think it was going to be me. Not yet. The rains started on the 14th of May. By the 17th I had Fence down, Ankel standing in water, and Del Pruitt riding the South Channel every 4 hours looking at that cut bank, with an expression on his face that told me everything I needed to know without him saying a word. On the evening of the 17th I wrote out myself, because there are things you have to see with your own eyes, and I looked at the cut bank in the last gray light, with the water running hard and brown, and carrying sticks and clots of mud, and I could see where the undercut had gone. 6 feet of bank gone in 3 days. Maybe 6 more feet left before the channel found the angle it wanted and jumped. I was standing there on my horse in the rain, looking at 20 years of work getting ready to go sideways, and I heard someone say from the other side of the channel, the bend's going to shear, turned. Across 20 feet of running water on the opposite bank, which was her land, quarter section, Nora Voss was sitting on a brown mule, wearing a canvas coat with the collar up. And she was looking at the cut bank the same way I was. I said, I know that. She said, you've got maybe 2 days, I said. I know that too. She didn't say anything for a minute. Just looked at the bank. Then she said, you need to bag that cut. Fill sandbags and pack the undercut from the top before it gets any softer. It's the only way to buy enough time for the water to drop. I looked at her. I looked at the bank. I looked back at her. I said, that's my land, she said. I know it is. And she turned the mule and rode back toward her place. I thought about it for the rest of that evening and most of the night. I had sand. There was a gravel bar downstream I'd been pulling from for 2 years. I had bags, or could get them. What I didn't have was enough hands. And what I also didn't have, though I wasn't ready to say this out loud to myself yet, was a better idea. Del Pruitt, when I told him the next morning, said, that's right. Just those 2 words. Like it was obvious. Like a 28-year-old widow from a quarter section across the creek had simply said the obvious thing, and he couldn't understand why we were discussing it. Rode to her place that afternoon. It was a small operation, cleaner than I expected. The tar-paper house was weathered but tight. The yard kept up, a kitchen garden staked out and just starting to show green despite the wet. She had a milk cow, 4 or 5 cattle in a small pasture, and a corral with 2 horses and the brown mule. The place had the look of land where someone was paying attention. She came out before I'd gotten off my horse. She'd heard me coming. The ground was soft, and a horse makes noise on soft ground. And she stood in the yard with her arms at her sides and waited. I got down, I said. I need hands for the sandbagging. I've got 2 men and my foreman, and it's not enough to do it in the time we have, she said. I know, I said. I can pay for your help. She said, I don't want pay. That stopped me. I said, what do you want? She was quiet for a moment, and I had the sense of someone measuring something. Not me, exactly, but the whole situation, all the pieces of it, the way you measure a thing before you cut it. She said, water rights on the north draw. You've got the deed. The draw comes off your land onto mine. And you've been holding the rights since before my husband filed. I want them transferred. The North Draw was a seasonal creek that fed her pasture in spring. Without the water rights I held, she was legally subject to me diverting it upstream, which I'd never done but could do, and which, on a dry year, would have mattered considerably. It was worth. I calculated quickly, the way you do when someone has asked for something before you've had time to think. It was worth something. Real. Not a fortune, but real. She was looking at me the way she'd looked at Clyde Dunmore over the flour. Not aggressive. Just clear, I said. All right, she said. I'll have my 2 cents at your cut bank before dark. She did. Shh. What happened over the next 36 hours I've told pieces of before. But I've never told the whole of it in the right order, so I'm going to try. We worked through the night of the 18th and the full day of the 19th. 7 of us total. Dell, my 2 men, 2 hands. A pair of brothers named Casper and untold, solid, quiet men who worked like they were made of cable, and Nora Voss herself, and me. The sand was coming from the downstream gravel bar, hauled up in a wagon that got mired twice in the first hour and had to be pulled out by nurses both times. The bags were grain sacks, mostly doubled up where they were thin, and filling them was wet, miserable work because the rain pooling in the sacks as you filled them. Dell rigged a canvas canopy over the filling station, 2 fence posts and a piece of tarp, and that helped. Casper Dre never said a word the whole night. Andel said about 4 words total, all of them practical. 2 men, Rudy and a boy named Ferris, who'd been with me 11 months, worked steady without being told twice. Dell moved everywhere at once, the way old foremen do, seeing the whole board and adjusting without drama. And Nora Voss worked. She didn't stand back. That was the first thing I understood. She was in the water with us when the water needed wading, up the bank with a loaded bag on her shoulder when the bank needed loading, in the mud when there was nothing but mud to be in. The water in that channel was cold, snowmelt cold, the kind that hurts after a minute, and she waded into it without hesitation every time it needed wading. She'd knotted her coat tight and pulled her boots on over her trouser legs, and that was the only concession she made to the conditions. She wasn't doing it to prove anything. She was doing it because there was work and she was there, and that was the only logic she seemed to operate by. This was around 10 o'clock in the hardest part of the rain, when the channel had come up another 3 inches, and we were racing to get the first layer of bags seated before the water undermined our footing on the bank. And she was chest deep in the channel with Andel, steadying the bottom course of bags against the current while Dell drove the stakes in from above. The water was pulling at her, and she was braced against it with both feet planted in the gravel, and she was not moving. Face was wet, and her hair was soaked through, and she was looking at the bags the way you look at a problem you are in the middle of solving. She glanced up and caught me watching her, and she said, "I'm fine. Get the next course ready." I got the next course ready. By midnight of the first night, we had the undercut section packed and staked with the sandbags, and Dell had shored the top with a row of cut timber. D had the sense to haul out before dark. By 3 in the morning, the rain was still falling but lighter, and we could feel, this sounds strange, you can feel it when you've been working a bank like that. We could feel the whole structure settle and hold. The bags had compressed down and taken the shape of the undercut, and the timber above was carrying the weight of the bank instead of the hollowed out that had been there before. Dell put his hand flat on the packed bags and was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Solid." At 4 in the morning, Dell said he thought it was going to make it. At 4:30, Nora Voss sat down on the lumber pile with her coat still dripping and her boots soaked through, and she ate half a cold biscuit from her coat pocket without saying a word, looking out at the dark water. She was 40 feet away from me. I was watching the bank, or telling myself I was watching the bank. What I was actually doing was looking at her. She was not a soft woman. I don't mean that as criticism. I mean it as the plainest true description I can give. Her face was lean, weathered for her age from the outdoor life. There were lines at the corners of her eyes and a particular set to her jaw that you see sometimes in people who have had things go very wrong and have not allowed the wrongness to run them down. Her hair had come out of whatever she'd put it in sometime around midnight and was dark and wet, and she hadn't bothered with it. She was just sitting there, eating her biscuit, with the look of a person who has done what they came to do, and is now considering the next thing. Otto Voss was a lucky man. Then I thought, Otto Voss is gone, and this woman is sitting on a lumber pile in the middle of the night on my land, having just saved my land, and I am thinking about her dead husband. I went and checked the bank again. The rain stopped on the 20th. Creek crested on the 21st, and then slowly, over the course of a week, came back down. The bank held. The south pasture grass survived, just barely. There was some scour along the low edge, but the main seeding was intact. And by June it was coming in the way I'd hoped, thick and green, $20 a ton grass, where there'd been bare ground. I had the water rights on the North Draw transferred to Nora Voss within the week. I had my lawyer in Dunmore draw the paperwork and I wrote it out to her myself. She read it through, all of it, every clause, told me something. And then she signed it and thanked me in a way that was neither warm nor cold. Just accurate, like a transaction completed the way it should be. I rode back to the ranch. I did not stop thinking about her. Dell noticed before I did. Dell noticed most things before I did. That was part of what made him valuable. He didn't say it directly. Del Pruitt did not speak directly when a sideways remark would do. What he said, about 3 weeks after the flood work was, "That Voss woman knows cattle." I said, "What's that?" he said. "Watched her work that little herd of hers when I was riding the south fence. She knows what she's doing. That German husband must have taught her something. Or else she came that way." I said, "That right." Dell looked at me in the way he had, like a man examining a fence post for rot. "Shame she's out there on her own on that quarter section," he said. "Country for one person," I said. "She seems to manage." "She does," Dell said. "Considerable for one person, though, considerable." He went back to whatever he was doing. I stood there a moment, and then went and found something to do that was far away from Del Pruitt and his sideways remarks. I went to church in Dunmore twice a month, not because I was a devout man, but because was it what a man in my position did in that time and that place, and because the 20 minutes after the service were when you learned what was happening in the valley. Who was selling? Who was struggling? Who'd had trouble with the weather, or the market, or a neighbor? On a Sunday in late June, I heard that the Voss place had been approached by Reardon Leland. Reardon Leland was what you might call a land consolidator. He moved through the valley every few years in the wake of hard times, buying out the homesteads that hadn't made it, offering fair prices that were also low prices, because the people he was buying from had no other options. He wasn't a villain exactly. He was a man who understood timing. He'd bought 4 homesteads in the past 2 years and sold 3 of them on to a Denver investment company that was building up a position in the valley. What Reardon was doing on the Voss quarter section was obvious. The woman was alone. She had no family. The homestead was, and the last years had been hard on everyone. He would have heard that her husband was gone. He would come in with a number, fair, but low, and the implicit understanding that the alternative was more years of this, alone in this country. I don't know what she said to him. I heard 3 different versions of what she said to him, 2 of which involved language that the women at church were reluctant to repeat clearly, and one of which just said she'd shown him off the property. Whatever she said, he went. But I knew Reardon Leland. He didn't go far. I rode to her place on a Tuesday, not a church day, not a trade day. Tuesday, in the middle of a working week, which meant I was making a choice about what work I was doing. Told myself I was riding the south fence anyway. I told myself it was on the way. Del Pruitt said nothing. When I saddled up and rode south instead of east where the south fence actually was, and the fact that he said nothing told me more than if he'd said something. She was mending fence on the east side of her property when I found her. Alone, the way she was always alone. Post driver leaning against the fence. Wire stretchers hung off the top rail. She'd gotten the post in and was threading the wire when she heard me and turned. I got down from my horse, I said. I heard Reardon Leland came to see you, she said. He did, I said. He'll be back, he doesn't stop. She said, I know the type. I had planned what I was going to say. On the ride over. I had figured it out the way I figured out herd decisions and range decisions, practically, with the pieces laid out in a useful order. I was going to say, this place is too small to winter alone on. I was going to say, Leland will come back with another offer, and then another. I was going to say, there's a sensible arrangement to be considered. I'd been working it out for 3 weeks, if I'm honest. Working out the practical case for it. The water rights, the quarter section, bottomland grass, the south pasture. 2 pieces of adjacent land that made more sense together than apart. A widow alone who needed scale. A widower alone who needed. I had to think carefully about how to say what I needed, so I'd been saying it to myself in terms of the land instead, which is a thing men do when they want something, and don't know how to want it plainly. Instead, what I said was, my wife's been gone 4 years. She looked at me. She said, I know that. I said, this is not a sensible thing I'm about to say. She kept looking at me. She had put the wire stretcher down. The late morning sun was hard on her face, and she didn't squint against it the way most people do. She just looked at you straight. The light be damned. I said, I have been thinking about you since the night on the bank, she said. I know that too, I said. You couldn't. And then I stopped, because I'd lost the practical order of what I was going to say. You couldn't possibly want to marry a man my age who runs 22,000 acres, and has no children and has been alone for 4 years and probably got set in his ways before that, she said. Why not? I said. That's your answer? She said. I have my own conditions, I said. Tell me, she said. The quarter section stays in my name, I said. All right, she said. I keep the water rights, I said. They were always yours, she said. I work the land here the way I work it. I don't run it through you. I run it myself, and I run your south pasture with you, if you'll have me on that. Because I know bottomland grass, and you've got $2,000 of it that needs managing. I said. I'll have you on that. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved the grass on the hillside behind her. A hawk went over, high up, turning slow circles the way they do on a thermal, she said. Your land is a good piece of land. I knew that the first time Otto rode me through the valley to look at the quarter section. I thought, whoever owns that ground, they did something right. A pause. It's kept well, I said. It is now. 3 bad years came close to finishing it, she said. I know. Most things come close to finishing, one time or another. She picked up the wire stretcher. Help me finish this section, she said. Then I'll make coffee. I tied my horse to the fence rail and helped her finish the section. The work took about 20 minutes. We didn't talk much while we worked. There was a rhythm to it, and we found it quickly. The way you find a rhythm with someone who knows the work, and I was aware the whole time of the ease of it. 2 people doing a practical thing together without friction. It sounds ordinary. It wasn't. We were married in August, by the Methodist minister in Dunmore, in a ceremony that lasted 12 minutes, because Nora had told the minister she didn't need the long version, and he, being a man of some sense, had not argued with her. Del Pruitt stood up with me. The Drewey brothers, Casper and Andel, came for Nora's side. There was no one else, and that was how we both wanted it. I have been to weddings where the whole thing felt like a performance, the people at the center performing the expected feelings for the people in pews, everybody waiting for it to be done. This was not like that. What I remember is the minister reading the words and Nora looking at me the whole time with that direct look she had, the light be damned look, like she was checking that I was the man she'd decided I was, and finding that I was in fact that man. And I remember thinking, nobody has looked at me like this, not in a long time, not like they actually saw me. My first wife, Cora, God rest her, had been a gentle woman, and I had loved her and she had loved me in the way a gentle woman loves a man, which is warmly, and from a slight remove, the way you love a landscape. Nora looked at me the way you look at something you are intending to keep. It was different. I didn't have a word for it at the time, and I'm not sure I have one now. Sat in my chest the whole 12 minutes like a coal that had just caught. She moved on to the Cross Ranch in late August, but she kept working the quarter section. Rode over there 3 mornings a week, sometimes 4, with Andel Drewey, who she'd taken on permanent. She had plans for the ground that she'd been working out since Otto died, she said. She'd seen what it could carry if managed right, and she was going to find out if she was right. I stayed out of it, not out of indifference, out of respect. Because once watching her work was one of my greater pleasures by that point, and I didn't want to complicate the pleasure by inserting myself into it. What I did do was ride the south pasture with her, the way she'd asked. Every week, sometimes more. She knew bottomland grass, the way I knew high-range cattle, which is to say she knew it, the way a person knows something they came to through necessity and then fell into loving. She'd grown up on creek-bottom ground in Missouri, she told me, and her father had run a small dairy, and she'd learned the grass before she learned much else. We walked that pasture and she would crouch down and pull up a handful of soil and look at it and tell me what it was doing and what it needed. She was right every time. I'd been ranching that ground for 22 years, and I learned things in 6 months of walking it with her that I hadn't known. There was one afternoon in October, the light going amber and low the way it does in fall, and she crouched down in the middle of the pasture and pulled up a plug of sod and smelled it. Just put her nose to it and breathed in. I was about to ask what she was looking for, and she held up one finger without looking at me. Wait. And she kept looking at the root structure. Then she said, "This section's wet, not from the flood. It's seeping from somewhere up the slope. You've got a slow leak somewhere on this east hill that's been feeding this corner." I hadn't known. I'd owned that land for 22 years, and I hadn't known there was a seep. We found it the next day. A small spring coming out under a rock shelf on the east slope, probably 30 years old, draining slow into the ground. We cut a diversion ditch and dried the corner out in 2 weeks. The grass that came in there the following spring was the best on the whole pasture. Dell said after about 3 months, "Good acquisition, Cross." I said, "Don't call my wife an acquisition, Dell," he said. "No, I mean the water rights on the North Draw. Good piece of business," and went about his day. The winter that followed was hard. January came in with a cold that sat on the valley for 6 weeks without moving. The kind of cold that kills cattle that aren't right and tests the ones that are. We lost 11 head, which was more than I wanted but less than I'd feared. On the quarter section, Nora lost 2 of her 5 cattle and her milk cow to a week in February where the temperature dropped to 30 below, and the wind came with it. That week in February was the hardest I can remember, and I have a long memory for hard winters. The kind of cold where the nails in the barn walls shrink, and you can hear the wood contracting in the night like something alive trying to pull itself together. My hands had the stove in the bunkhouse running flat out, and I had the kitchen stove and the sitting room stove both going in the house, and still, on the worst nights, the window glass ran water on the inside from the condensation and then froze solid again before morning. Nora made 2 trips a day to the quarter section during that week. Once at first light and once in the middle of the afternoon. Check the cattle and break the ice in the water trough and put down feed. I offered her Rudy and she took him, and they rode out together those mornings in the dark with the cold coming off them in steam when they came back. She didn't complain. She didn't talk much at all that week, which was her way with difficulty. She went quiet and narrow, focused on the next practical thing and the next one after that, and didn't spend anything on words. On the 5th day of the cold, she came in from the second trip and she stood in the kitchen doorway still in her coat and she said, "Dolly's gone." I said, "I know." I'd seen it coming from the way she'd looked at the cow 2 days before, that same look she'd given the cut bank. Measuring what was left, she said, "She was a good cow," I said. She was. She was holding the coffee cup in both hands, not drinking it, just holding it. Lamps was on the table between us, and the light it made was warm and small in the cold kitchen. Outside, the wind moved against the walls. She said, "I don't grieve cattle. That's not what this is," I said. "I know that too," she said. "It's just sometimes." And then she stopped. I waited. I've learned in my life that most worthwhile things people are about to say require the other person to wait for them. She said, "Sometimes I miss having enough of everything, of hands, of money, of..." She paused. "I'm not complaining. This is just a thing I'm telling you." I said, "I know the difference." She looked at me. I said, "You don't have to manage the shortage alone anymore." That's all I wanted to say. She was quiet for another moment. The wind pushed again. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over my hand, the gesture of a practical woman, not a soft one, which made it mean more, not less. And she held it there for a minute, and then she picked up the coffee and drank some. We sat there for a while longer than we needed to in the lamplight, with the cold outside and the stove ticking behind us. I didn't say anything more. She didn't either. There was nothing more that needed saying. After a while, I put more wood on the stove and she went to check that the back door was latched against the wind. That was all. It was enough. Spring came earlier than the year before. March was still cold but not killing cold, and by mid-March the creek was running clear and moderate. Nothing like the previous year's violence. And the south pasture was already showing the green at the roots. Reardon Leland came back in April. He hadn't learned, or he had and didn't care, and he rode out to the quarter section on a Wednesday, with his hat and his careful voice and his number. Nora's account of it, me that evening, with the flatness of someone recounting a minor inconvenience. She'd been in the kitchen garden. Leland had come to the fence and called out, and she'd walked over and he'd given his price. Higher this time, she said, which meant he wanted it or had a buyer. And he'd gone through his reasoning, the hard country, the long winters, a woman alone, being a difficult situation. She'd listened to all of it without interrupting him, which I thought was either patience or the gathering of something. Then she'd said, "I'm not alone. I'm the wife of Harlan Cross, and this land is part of the Cross holdings now, and you would be well advised to get off it." Leland had apparently looked at her for a moment, calibrating, she'd said. He's particular about trespassers. Leland had tipped his hat and gone. She told me this the way she told me about the fence that needed mending on the east line, or the calving that had gone sideways on Tuesday. Practical, sequential, and done. And then she looked at me with that direct look and said, "Is that all right? That I used your name like that?" I said, "You can use my name any way you want." She looked at me another moment, then she said, "Good. What I keep coming back to, all these years later, is the night on the bank. Not because it was the beginning, though it was, but because of what was in it. 7 people, working in the rain and the dark, to hold a piece of earth that the water was trying to take, and the one among us who'd seen the solution first was a 28-year-old widow across the creek. From me who had no legal obligation to say a word and no personal obligation beyond a decent human instinct, and she'd said it anyway, plainly, without asking for credit. That's not a small thing. In my experience, it's not a common thing. I have known men all my life, capable men, smart men, who will let a problem get worse rather than say the obvious solution if the solution belongs to someone else, if saying it doesn't add to their own account. I have done it myself, I'll admit. It's a particular kind of vanity that comes with a kind of position. She had none of it. She had the solution and she said the solution, and then she turned her mule and went back to her place. And when I came to her with the work that needed doing, she told me what she wanted, and it was a fair thing, a thing any reasonable man would recognize as fair, and we traded, and the work got done and the land was held. That is, I've come to think, exactly how a life should work. You have something. The other person has something. You trade honestly, and you do the work, and the thing that needed saving gets saved. I have thought sometimes about what I was, before she rode that mule to the bank and told me the answer. I was a man with 22,000 acres and a good foreman, and 3 bad years. Behind me and more bad years may be coming. Holding on by the constitution I'd inherited from my father, which is to say by stubbornness more than anything else. I was respected in the valley the way large landowners are respected, which is to say, people didn't cross me, people wanted things from me, people tipped their hat. That is not the same as being seen. That is not the same as being valued. I didn't know that I wanted to be seen. A man my age doesn't often admit that to himself. He has spent too many years building the version of himself that doesn't need it. You get thick-skinned and wide-shouldered and capable, and you get used to being the one other people lean on, and somewhere in all that getting used to, you stop noticing the absence of the thing you wanted in the first place, which was just someone to look at you and find you worth the looking. She did that. She read me the way she read the ground, not romantically, not sentimentally, but with the clear and practical eye of a person who wants to know what's actually there. She looked at a man who was holding on by stubbornness and too much acreage and not enough help, and she found him worth staying with. Not because it was easy, because she decided it was worth it. Because she looked at the Cross Ranch and what it cost a man to hold it, and she said, "That's something real." A woman like that, freely choosing, that's not a small gift. That's the largest gift there is. I am not a man who was given things easily. My father built Barichemi on dry years and bad beef prices, and a constitution that didn't know how to quit, and I inherited the land and the constitution both, and I've used the second one to hold on to the first for 30 years. What I didn't have, too long, was someone who saw that. Who saw what it cost and what it was worth and looked at it the way Nora looked at it, like something she intended to stay with. You want to know what it feels like at my age, to have a woman like that beside you? A good woman who chose you. Not because you were the only option, not because you made it easy, because she looked at you and your land and your life and decided it was worth the choosing. It feels like the bank holding, like standing in the rain at 4 in the morning with the water still running hard, and Dell saying, I think it's going to make it, and knowing he's right, and knowing that everything downstream, the pasture, the grass, the years you've put in, is going to be there in the morning. That's it. That's the whole of it. There's one more thing. About a month after the wedding, Del Pruitt gave me a piece of advice. This was unusual. Del generally waited to be asked. But he came to me one morning while I was at the corral, and he stood there a moment in that way he had, when he was going to say something sideways. And then for once he said it straight. He said, don't be an old fool about it. I said, about what? He said, about her. About the help she gives you. Some men, when a woman helps them, really helps them, they can't leave it alone. They have to make it smaller or make it theirs. Don't do that. I looked at him, he said. She saved your land. The whole of it, the south pasture, maybe the ranch. Let it be what it is, I said. It is what it is, he said. Good, and went back to work. I have tried to let it be what it was. The sandbags were her idea. The water rights were her terms. The quarter section is in her name, and she runs it the way she runs it, and I ride it, with her when she wants me there. The south pasture is our shared work, and the grass is better than it's ever been. 300 head running that bottomland last fall, and every acre of it carrying what it should. She found the seep on the East Hill that I'd been ranching over for 22 years, without knowing it was there. She found something in me the same way. Not a weakness, a resource I hadn't known to use. Some channel that had been running quiet, underground for a long time, waiting for someone to find the right place to cut a ditch and let it work. And on certain evenings, the long summer evenings, when the light goes gold and flat on the valley, and the creek runs quiet, and the cattle are settled in the south pasture, she'll come stand beside me at the fence and she'll look out at it, the same way she looked at that cut bank in the dark and the rain, seeing what's there, seeing what it wants, seeing what it needs. And sometimes she'll say something, and sometimes she won't, and sometimes I'll say something back. But mostly we just look at the land. It's ours. It holds. That's enough for a man who went a long time with almost nothing.